On April 7, 1630, a fleet of ships carrying about 1,000 British men, women, and children began a 3-month voyage to the New World. They would soon arrive in what is now Boston, Massachusetts, the city they created. They were the Puritans. Their leader was the Reverend John Winthrop, whom noted historian Paul Johnson has dubbed the first great American. Aboard the ship Arabella, Winthrop preached a sermon to his followers called A Model of Christian Charity. His voice carried so that those in all of the ships could hear him.
We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, and 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. The Lord will make our name a praise and glory, so that men shall say of succeeding plantations, The Lord make it like that of New England, for we must consider that we shall be like a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are on us. John Winthrop.
The city upon a hill reference of Reverend John Winthrop, who is quoting Jesus, was a favorite phrase of Ronald Reagan. In 1989, in his last radio address, outgoing President Ronald Reagan referenced it.
The hope of human freedom, the quest for it, the achievement of it, is the American saga. And I've often recalled one group of early settlers making a treacherous crossing of the Atlantic on a small ship when their leader, a minister, noted that perhaps their venture would fail and they would become a byword, a footnote to history. But perhaps, too, with God's help, they might also found a new world, a city upon a hill, a light unto the nations.
Reverend John Winthrop's settlement of Boston in 1630 was the first major wave of Puritans to come to America. The Puritans held the first secret ballots in America to elect their minister. Even the term election was used by the Puritans because they believed in the Calvinist doctrine of election, that some were chosen by God to be saved. When an election was held, the question was, which of these candidates seems to exhibit the characteristics of someone who is elect? Furthermore, the Puritans implemented the practice of having Election Day sermons.
An Election Day sermon is that on the day of the election, they would have the minister, they would choose a minister in a local community or in a colony to actually give a sermon about the morality and character of the men that should be elected that day, or women elected to office. And they did this in America throughout the colonial era, and really caused the electorate to think morally and spiritually that their vote counted, that they were making a decision that would determine their freedom.
The devout men and women who settled New England, the Pilgrims and then the Puritans, saw themselves as being on an errand into the wilderness, according to Reverend Cotton Mather, who lived from 1663 until 1728. Cotton Mather was a prolific Puritan divine from whom we learn so much about their settlements. Mather, who graduated from Harvard in 1678 when he was 15, wrote hundreds of books, including a large 2-volume set, Magnalia Christi Americana, or The Great Works of Christ in America. It was first published in 1702, and it provides an early account of so much from that era, including his pious ancestors.
Wherever they sat down, they were so mindful of their errand into the wilderness that still one of their first works was to gather a church into the covenant and order of the gospel. Cotton Mather.
This was not an easy errand. The shores were inhospitable, as were the winters, which proved so fatal at first. The Indians were hostile. Many things were going against the Puritans. Nonetheless, they viewed their efforts as being blessed by God. Speaking of New England at large, Cotton Mather would declare,
"Never was any plantation brought under such a considerableness in a space of time so inconsiderable. An howling wilderness in a few years became a pleasant land, accommodated with the necessaries, yea, and the conveniences of humane life. The gospel has carried with it a fullness of all other blessings. Cotton Mather.
Although initially the Puritans were technically members of the Church of England, which has a rule by bishops model, in America they chose to adopt the congregational model, the one practiced by the Pilgrims. This model stressed self-government for each congregation. They would vote in their own pastors.
In a sense, the clergy were the first elected officials of the new American society. A society which, to that extent, had a democratic element from the start. Paul Johnson.
Boston flourished as a town the Puritans built from scratch.
The dispensations of the gospel were never enjoyed by any town with more liberty and purity for so long a while together. Cotton Mather.
Mather pointed out that Boston had been threatened many times, so the city officials called for days of fasting and prayer. They called on God to spare them from multiple fires, from a potential French invasion, and from outbreaks of smallpox. They repeatedly saw answers to their prayers. And what was the practical impact of personal piety on Boston in that era? A 17th century traveler from London said, "I have lived in a country where in 7 years I never saw a beggar, nor heard an oath, a cuss word, nor looked upon a drunkard." He was talking about Boston.
It may be there never was any region under heaven happier than poor New England hath been in magistrates, whose true piety was worthy to be made the example of after ages. Cotton Mather.
The Puritans were dedicated to the rule of law, so they commissioned a minister who had legal training to assemble together principles of the Bible that would spell out civil liberties that the colonists could implement. Reverend Nathaniel Ward thus created in 1641 the Massachusetts Body of Liberties.
The Puritans cared very much about civil liberties and, of course, were very righteous in their understanding of God's design of the world.
Civil liberties spelled out in the Massachusetts Body of Liberties included due process and avoiding double jeopardy. John Winthrop, the key Puritan leader in Boston, was a strong leader, and in some cases he was accused of being too strong. But some historians, like Paul Johnson, author of A History of the American People, note that Winthrop had to be strong to build up everything from scratch. In only a few decades, Reverend John Winthrop had overall succeeded in creating a settlement based on the Bible. The city on a hill was becoming established.